Hi, good evening. I am Alexa Greist. I'm the Associate Curator of and the R. Fraser Elliott Chair of Prints and Drawings at the Art Gallery of Ontario. And I want to thank you for joining us this evening. Share my screen. And before we begin our event this evening, I want to acknowledge that the AGO is on Mississauga Neshwabe territory, Mississauga. It's also governed by a treaty between the Mississauga of the Credit and the Canadian government. Toronto is Mississauga Neshwabe territory. It has been occupied by other Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee and Wendat confederacies. Oop. And I also want to thank generously for the AGO RBC Emerging Artists Workshops are generously supported by our signature partner, RBC. Tonight, we are going to be speaking with three wonderful artists and an artist critic. They'll get to tell you about themselves. I want to briefly introduce each of our panelists this evening, talking about me being online. After I briefly introduce each one, then I'm going to give each of them time to introduce themselves, talk a little bit about maybe the theme of being online. And then after that, we will engage with these three questions. I know it says answer, but we may not answer. We may just engage with these three questions that you see on your screen here. What is the best way to present or represent your many selves? How is your work an extension of you? How do you share and or sell your digital selves? And how do museums respond or not to digital self-representation and self-presentation? The first artist I was speaking about today is Hanif Janmohamed, and you see here a longer biography, but I just say that I have had a pleasure of hearing a bit about some of his projects that you'll be hearing about tonight, and I think you'll be very excited to see what and how he engages with the idea of self and our presentation of ourselves and our conceptions of ourselves and how maybe our minds help to make these representations come alive. Next, we have Zarina Mohammed, who many of you may know, is one of two of the team responsible for the White Cube. You can find them on their website, writing about art, writing about food, writing about life, also on Twitter and also on Instagram. And thirdly, Timothy Hunter, who we have had the pleasure of having at the AGO and working with us as an artist on site. And he's multidisciplinary artist and curator who is based here in Toronto. And I really look forward to hearing and seeing his incredibly vibrant and rich website and how he uses that to represent his work and to explore his practice. So I want to give the artists a chance now to speak. And I think I will have them go and present in the same order that we discussed. So that'll be Hanif being our first person up.
Okay, thanks so much. I'm just going to talk a little bit about a project that's coming up at the AGO that we're working on. I'll share my screen. And the project's called Inner Selfies, Brain Terrains at the Art Gallery of Ontario. The self, the place where we live, is a place of illusion. Goodness is connected with the attempt to see the unself, to pierce the veil of selfish consciousness and join the world as it really is. It's a quote from Iris Murdoch, The Sovereignty of Good. Millions of selfies are taken and shared every day, yet what do they really reveal about us? Selfies flatten differences while demanding conformity with culturally defined visual status cues. Inner Selfies rejects the nullifying appeal to public judgment, too often based on superficial or irrelevant attributes that define selfie culture, like appearance, race, weight, gender. and instead replacing with a celebration of inner depth and diversity that transcends physical markers of identity and status. Inner Selfies takes us on a journey into this illusory place of self. In an age characterized by superficial digital selfies and influencers, Inner Selfies takes us below the surface into the shifting terrain of the self. We emerge with an interactive digital portrait, a dynamic inner selfie that asks us to consider these flickering shapes of self and non-self. The guiding principles stem from an exploration of qualities that make up our sense of self. What is it? Is it located? Are we our feelings, our memories, our impulses? Are we what others reflect back to us? Are we the echoes of place, of context and experience? Each of us experiences life as a journey, one that is unknown and unseen by others when they look at us. What people see are external markers of identity interpreted in the present without reference to the interiority of experiences that have deeply shaped us. So inner selfies offer all of us, both those who create them and those who view them, a reason to step back and question assumptions about identity. We discover new expressions of our inner worlds and renew our connections with our deeper feelings, meanings, and questions about ourselves and our world. Inner selfies help us to locate ourselves in those places that define our core sense of self. They expose and acknowledge personal trajectories as vital components of one's identity. They celebrate the inner depth and diversity that transcends physical markers of identity, meaning, and status. They empower users to articulate their own digital identity in contrast to big data's predatory profiling. Inner selfies invite critical self-reflection and promote an approach to digital self-representation that's inherently exploratory and affirming. Thanks.
I think it's me next, so I'm gonna jump straight into it. Hey everyone, thanks for having me. Bear with when I do that like fun, awkward, setting up the slideshow bit. All right, hi, I'm Zarina Mohammed. I'm from The White Cube, and we are a website. Well, The White Cube is a website where we publish art criticism, recently criticism, reviews of video games, and writing about food and life, and like odd bits of cultural detritus that we just kind of come across in our lives as critics, but also explorers and like just people who experience things. And I think part of the way we write about art and all these many other things is just like we are babies trying lemons for the first time. So that's the vibe. Very unprofessional. I'm going to talk a little bit about like the practicalities of being online and presenting yourself online in like a very kind of literalist sense, because I just love thinking about how and why artists choose, make certain choices. Like how do artists do what they do? Why do they do what they do? And like practically, what's the knock-on effect? How does it all work? I will say though, it's important to have fun and be yourself. Like all of this is conjecture. There's no specific one way you need to present yourself online. The idea that like one size fits all for every artist is a bit wild, and like a lot of this is just like conjecture. Yeah. And I think, yeah, there are so many different ways to be and exist online. There's no kind of one route towards success or like one route towards being like a smash hit artist. Having said that though, back in 2018, I'm going to like flag a series of texts, and the first one of these is from 2018. My collaborator Gabrielle de la Fuente, GDLP, wrote a text called "How to Get an Exhibition," which is clickbait, I will admit, but it is also quite literally a text about how to get an exhibition. She runs through the ways that new baby kind of emerging artists that are like fresh out of their BA can swindle their way into an exhibition, and from that first exhibition how they can get the next one and the one after that and the one after that, like the baby steps towards building a career. Because when we graduated from RBA, we were absolutely baffled about the whole process of like how what do we do now? Like what do you do? How do you get an exhibition? It seemed to be this like lockbox piece of information that no one ever discussed, especially when they were coming to do visiting lectures at art school with us. Like no one really spoke about that initial step, how you get your first foot on the ladder, right? And this text covers ways that artists are prepared to be very sociable online, very sociable online and offline. I will say that it describes one particular way that works for a lot of artists in the UK. A lot, not all. And it involves like a degree of involvement in that sociability. And it also describes a way that a way that you can present yourself online as well as offline, like that nice mix. Worth a read if you want. We also write an agony column, like an advice column, I guess. We used to, back in 2019, write this advice column for Dazed Online, Dazed Digital, like online arm of Dazed and Confused. And now we write it for Elephant Magazine. Both are linked in our Instagram bio, if that's of interest. But this one in particular from 2019 might be of interest. How do I stand out on Instagram as an artist? And we kind of run through all the different ways that you can, I guess, present yourself specifically on Instagram. I think we also go into detail about websites and artist websites. We give a lot of examples of who we think do like Instagram and like their own artist websites. We go into depth about who we think does that well. So have a read of that. That's a bad link, but I can post it in the chat after I finish yakking on. It's also a valid strategy to just say that you don't want to be involved in any of that like rat race of like the attention economy. It's worth thinking about your public. Who are they? It might not be everyone. A private closed loop conversation between people that you know and trust that are part of your community, that's a valid public too. And you don't have to make your audience everyone. It doesn't have to be anyone that's like just walking by in a gallery or on the internet. Like you might be a chronically ill artist that or an artist with a chronic illness who only wants to make art for other chronically ill people to see. So then maybe the best place for your work isn't a gallery, it isn't Instagram, it's like within that closed loop, that protected system of your local community, And so maybe you can think about internet forums and postal exhibitions and just going around someone's house and visiting, showing them a painting. There are other ways of doing things. I mean, with that in mind, the last text I'm going to mention is not mine or Gabrielle's. It is quite old, actually, in the grand scheme of things, from 2014. So it predates the White Pew, ancient. It is something on Freeze online. I'll link this too. But it's a text called Network Fatigue by Pablo Larios. And it describes a way of making away from the internet, basically, like embracing the explicitly social. And I'm just going to read this bit. Hold on. Okay. Network fatigue is the image's prior admission of its own defeat before the matrix of connectivity. It constructs small mechanisms of temporary exclusion, what used to be called privacy, and which is partly, though not entirely, closed to counter larger, widespread ones that occurred under the spectre of the network and the social, but which only serve to exclude us from ourselves. I think that's probably the key bit, right? Network fatigue isn't new. I think artists have been working like this before the internet, obviously, but it's a way of embracing the local, the hyper-local within the space of your community. And I think it's really interesting to think about network fatigue in relation to, I don't know, a conversation about the way artists present themselves online within the digital sphere and the way they present and represent themselves. Because I think those are two different things. And like, what does, I don't know, privacy mean, and how can privacy be useful? Also, how can opacity be useful, maybe, as a more like, you know, theoretically dense terminology, to like throw that in there, bit of theory. But yeah, that's it, that's me.
Thank you. I had a complete and utter computer meltdown, but I'm here on my phone now. And I managed to hear to listen completely, Zarina. So thank you very much. And I would ask Timothy to go next.
Well, yeah, cool. I'm just going to share my screen here. Let's give it a refresh. Yeah, so I'm Timothy Yanick Hunter, multidisciplinary artist, Toronto-based artist. I work primarily with installation, video, sound, though my work kind of goes beyond that in terms of media. I guess with this conversation around online presence or being online, I felt appropriate to kind of zone in on my online project, True and Functional. So True and Functional, and let me know, is it, do we see it on the screen right now? I just click the refresh button. Bear with me, like the internet connection could be kind of choppy, so it's a pretty dense website. But yeah, so True and Functional kind of started as actually, really, it started from a bunch of songs and mixtapes that I was working on personally outside of my artwork. And I guess I was looking for a space to host the music on, quite simply. And I'm just scrolling through it. There's a lot to go through audio and sound wise or video wise. So just for brevity, I'm just going to kind of go through everything. But yeah, I was working on a batch of things, sound, video, and I was thinking about doing something in regards to music. Only thing is that I always felt there's this tension between maybe the more popular websites like YouTube, Instagram, SoundCloud, those things. Just like, I guess, the overall, the branding and some of those things that I feel a lot of users, a lot of us are kind of forced into to kind of participate in. So I wanted to make something that kind of really felt like my own. You know, growing up in like the 2000s, it's like you're so used to using things like MySpace or even Tumblr like later. And I found like the charm of those things to kind of be attractive to what I was trying to do with True and Functional. So the way it works is broken up into different volumes. Each volume has really it's a mix of really from images, PDFs, to parts of videos that I'm working on, and sound that I'm working on, or songs that I'm working on. The best way for me to describe it, I find, is I think of it as a type of kind of a sketchbook or an open learning space for myself that I can share with people. And I guess in regards to the topic today, I feel like True and Functional is the best kind of summary of like how I'm working, thinking about my work digitally, and like how to share it outside of just the gallery space. And so basically, I like to describe like what we see here as a large part of my learning process. The True and Functional kind of focuses on, there's no really immediate topic per page, but the idea is as my work develops, sometimes there's scraps of things that I find need a place, or I want to find a place. And so I find True and Functional outside of showing in the galleries or in a real life installation. I find True and Functional helps as a really good way for me to work out ideas. And sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes the works do end up being in real space. So my project with the AGO as an artist in residence, kind of, I'd already worked on a few iterations at this point. Just like zoom to the more recent one that I'm talking about. So with the AGO, I had kind of taken the opportunity in my residency to look through the Montgomery collection. And with the Montgomery collection, you know, for those who don't know, it's kind of like kind of archival batch of images from the Caribbean. And so I was using that as a jump off point for this page. And at the same time, also wanted to bridge a gap between like real life installation and something that's digital. This video here, and I'm not going to play the whole thing because that alone is already 3 minutes, if it will play. Let's see. But yeah, so seminar one at the AGO, I guess the meeting room, I'd done an installation there and kind of filmed it and documented it. And I took it onto this page. And so this is my first kind of time, my first opportunity really to take what I was doing with True and Functional and bring it into a real space. There we go. Maybe I'll like full screen it and I might scrub a bit as we go. But again, I was just trying to find ways to take what I do in person and also bring it online. So with the generosity of the AGO, I was able to pull off this like 4-channel installation in the room. Many people asked me like, where they could find it, but the whole point was that it does only live here online. There's sound too. So this is kind of just like a nice summary of the work I've been doing. Sorry to cut it short, guys, but I don't want to take up too much time. And so the last iteration, this is the newest iteration, is I'm currently showing at the Toronto Biennial of Art, and I had done a record, which I essentially just took all 10 of the track here, and then this video is actually playing currently at the at Small Arms Mississauga. But yeah, it's a little choppy. Someone might be streaming some video next door to me, so. But yeah, so overall, yeah, I just felt like I wanted to work on something that had kind of summarized my work in an online kind of way. Also, gives accessibility to those who don't often maybe make their way to the gallery. I have a lot of friends and family who maybe the gallery and the museum isn't really somewhere that they often find themselves. So I always felt like having things like this or working on something like this was a nice way to kind of share that. And that's it.
Thank you. But I was taking lots of notes and have questions they're not necessarily a question that I hope we'll get to, but as well as the ones that we plan to discuss. So, but I think I do still want to start by thinking about from each of your own perspectives, either as the perspective of someone looking at art, thinking about helping art, even though I know that's actually all of you are thinking about helping fellow artists as well. But what do you see as the best way to present or represent your many selves if we're thinking about this digital realm? And you don't all have to answer a question. And I think, we're a small enough group, you could just unmute yourself and take a stab.
Oh, go on. I'll answer.
Oh,
no, you go.
No, you go.
I think I really don't know what the best way is. And I think maybe as a critic, I'm in a cool, easy distance position because I don't have to really think too much about how I present myself. I think as a critic, you just kind of get presented to the world anyway through perceptions, right? Like it kind of, a lot of that work is done for you, but I think as an artist, you have to invest quite a lot of time and effort in that, maybe not myth making and maybe not branding, but somewhere in between those two things, right? You've got to decide who you are and how you want to talk about what you do. And you've got to be quite intentional with the way you present yourself. I think it really is such a subjective question. There is no best way, because I have friends who are artists who do not have a public Instagram, do not have a website, and yet still kind of book shows and like have an incredibly like kind of cult online following via like little whispers. And I think that's been so beneficial for that friend. And I have friends who like post every little work in progress in the studio on their Instagram, and you know, book shows and get jobs. And it's just a matter of what works for you. And I think a lot of it is about your practice as well. Like how closely do you want to be associated with your practice? And are you kind of quite invested in storytelling, or do you want to step back and like have a bit of distance and opacity again? So yeah, I'm not sure about the word best, but yeah.
Yeah, I think it's kind of interesting to think about audience in an online context, because you know, what is the metric of an audience, and what is their engagement with the audience? How does that feed you? Is it, you know, through communication, discourse, dialogue? Is that small groups of people who are, you know, your true fans? These are all, I think, tough questions. And, you know, yeah, you find your way, I think, in the end is kind of how you do it. But I think it's interesting to think about what is the intention with communicating with your audience.
Yeah, I think my feeling somewhere in between what both of you said. I definitely agree that there's like no really right way. And as an artist, especially if we're talking about like the social media end of things, I find it really daunting to share a lot, even on a personal level outside of being an artist. Like I have to remind myself to do that a lot of the time. But at the same time, I feel like, I don't know, I feel like in terms of kind of like that between like the mythology and the branding, right? Like Zarina, you mentioned, like it's like there's also a wonderful opportunity in the middle of there to kind of create like a story. And I feel like it's a really, that as we're speaking about it, it's an interesting to be alive where you can kind of bridge this world between like fictional life and the reality, I guess. But as an artist, I mean someone who also like is hunched over the computer like all day. Really, it's it is nice to have like kind of these spaces to express yourself in certain ways that, you know, the internet has though changed a lot in the last, you know, decade or so, maybe more. So it feels different, but yeah, I don't know. It's such a wide thing to think about.
I feel like I want to give you a specific answer now, though, because we've all said, "Oh, there's no right way." But I'll tell you what I really like seeing. This might not be the right way, but it's the right way for me as a person who has an Instagram account, right? I really love it when artists are funny. I really like it when they've got a sense of humor and they take the piss out of themselves and their art and like the art world at the same time. And there are two Instagram accounts I'm thinking of, two artists. One of them is Bedwer. These are such UK references. I'm aware that these might not translate, but yeah. One of them is Bedwer Williams, who is a Welsh artist. And then there's also Luca George, who is an artist based in London. And they both are incredibly funny people. And their work is like, it engages with this kind of humor, this like, I don't know, quite laddie humor, like just such lads. And they're able to like, I don't know, take the piss out of themselves, the art world, and their work all at the same time, while also taking it really, really seriously. But that's part of the humor. I think that's the best way you can do it, but also no best way.
Something that keeps coming up, and I know that we had these you know, original questions, but the idea of story and narrative that we're just, that has come up quite a few times in numerous things that you have said, or even, Timothy, as you said, the sharing, like how much of you are you sharing on social media versus you as an artist, how much of your work you're sharing. And our question was a little more simple, and it was, how is your work an extension of you? But I think if you put that through the lens of, as you show it on the internet in whatever form you choose, choosing a different one, how do you feel maybe that is a, how is your work an extension of you is kind of a, how do you separate yourself from that job you have kind of question, but at the same time, as an artist, it has a very different meaning. But I wonder if you think that the ability or almost requirement to share for a lot of us, and for you as artists, has changed the way your work becomes an extension of yourself. If you have this platform or many platforms, do you think it changes that?
I would say for sure we're always colored by what we hear back. So it is a bit of a conversation in that way. But I was also just thinking about, humor and, what Zarina was saying. And, what is it that we respond to online? There's all these kind of curated entities and, we talk about branding and, we know that these are very much a curated kind of persona presented online. And so things like humor allow us to get to a sense of more genuine person. And I'm curious about that in terms of online presence, about how do you represent yourself? It's something I'm kind of struggle with myself, but it seems to me that the closer you can get to a genuine representation of who you are, the more interesting your relationship with the audience. Especially if we look at it as a virtual entity representing itself in a virtual environment, how close could you get to kind of real genuine experience and rapport?
Yeah, like I feel like there's also maybe, I mean, in response to like the extension part, like I could speak on my own work and myself, but I think that's why I kind of pivoted to using like a website rather than social media. Maybe I don't know. I just felt like having more control over it. Like, it's funny to think of where we all now are discussing like the humor part, but sometimes like I'll have like a post in mind and I'm like, that's crazy. I can't I can't post that. Even it could just be something silly, but and then you have something like having private accounts and like being able to like talk to literally like your own people a certain way, which is kind of cool too. But yeah, I feel like I feel like the authenticity can also come from not like overthinking it too much either. Something that I've also had to grow into. But then also, again, like, I don't know, I also feel like online and digital self is beyond, like, there's like 5 companies that run the internet. Like I don't need to really be on all of those things necessarily the same way. There's other spaces too outside of those to kind of extend yourself or share yourself through. Maybe I touched on the question, but yeah.
Yeah, I think this is kind of interesting. I mean, I don't know, Zarina, do you have a subscriber kind of model? Do people subscribe to your website?
We've got the most complicated financial system I think I've ever heard of, at least in the arts. So we use a website called Patreon, which is an American website. So it's slightly new on the ground on the UK. Like not many people in the arts. Well, people in the arts are using it now, but maybe they weren't like a couple of years ago when we started, and it felt like quite new and unusual. I think it's a bit more common now, but basically it allows you to sponsor us, much like you would a donkey. Like You can give £1 a month and sponsor an art critic. And I think for us, it's the easiest financial model, because the other alternative for us is like corporate funding, which we're always a bit like icked out about, and either that or public funding, which is how majority of arts activity in the UK is funded. But public funding bodies ask you to make a case for public value, and I don't know if we can, in good faith, make that case, because I'm sure that to our audience we are incredibly valuable. I'd like to think so, at least, anyway. But to the wider public, I'm not too sure. Like, I know that my aunts don't care about my aunts don't care about what I write, and fair play, they've got other things on their mind, you know. They don't particularly care about what I think about, like, you know, the next show on at Tate and why it's rubbish. It's not like of massive importance. It's not an essential service, I think. So we've always been a bit wary about making, I don't know, taking taxpayer money feels loaded. It makes a bit more sense for us to be funded directly by our readers, and funded by our readers in a way that, like, is a bit more accessible, doesn't really hide any exclusive content behind a paywall.
I've had a question come out to us, which I think I would ask now from the audience, because it is actually sort of tied to what we're talking about now. And this question comes from Eddie David, asking if branding is positioning ourselves in the market. Is it something we must do to foster financial stability? And I think you've already started talking about this in a way, Zarina, and finding a way that's comfortable. But is it something, as an artist, that, you're considering or thinking about it, as you've chosen, like Timothy, the way you've chosen to present your work on your own website, or Hanif, the way you're trying to think about your project? And I know, as we're talking about your project at the AGO as well. So your project is, going to have is going to be tied to a gallery in a way. So how does one, do you have to make money off of this aspect of your work? How do you go about doing that? Open it up.
Right. Well, I think, branding has a dark kind of phase, but it also is part of what's required. I would answer the question, yeah, you do have to think about branding, just because that's kind of a bit of the currency and the language. So it's a way of articulating what you present. And it helps you think about yourself and how you differentiating what you're doing as opposed to others and how that plays. But again, you have to get back from that to a more genuine space of, what's resonant for you and what works. And then coming back around to the kind of Patreon model, subscriber-based models of financial stability. I think it's really a wonderful time where that kind of direct support from your fan base can be a sustainable model, and you don't have to rely on public funding and so on. So, but then again, that does require a certain curating and thoughtfulness around what that means for people. So I think you can't avoid thinking about branding.
I think, like, in regards to, like, the idea of branding too, like Hanif, like you mentioning, it's like a real thing that especially artists, we have to consider as we're like marketing our work or whatever. But at the same time, I think it's interesting because in my layman's mind, I think of branding in a corporate sense of, like, attaching a story to move a product, really, or sometimes not even about the product, but it's just actually just creating a brand. So in a weird way, though, as artists, like, we're just making stories and creating, sometimes in my case, maybe images that tell a story, and kind of inadvertently you have a brand. Like, I never maybe have really thought of it too much that way, as positioning and branding. To be honest, like, True and Functional, like the website, is like a sneaky way for people to listen to my beats or something, right? Like, in a weird way. And so and you know, I've considered maybe ways to make money from it, but you know, I mean, at this point, it's really kind of just the love of making the work and just finding a place to put it on. You know, I'm maybe an idealistic kind of artist. Like, I enjoy what I do. I'm very privileged to just work this way. But I don't know. I feel like if a good story can be a good brand, a good imagery could be a good brand. But like, if you're an artist who's like who's invested in your practice, like, you kind of, no matter what, end up doing that, whether people even acknowledge it or not. Like, you kind of create a brand on your own. I think the circle comes back to maybe the authenticity, but there's a lot of inauthentic art that takes off too. Like, you know,
I think, yeah, I agree. I think calling it branding maybe sometimes feels a bit cynical. Like, super corporate, super slick. But I think one of the few only things that I actually genuinely learned from art school, like useful at least anyway, other than like just how to rob library books. But it was that like, as a person who's making something, not just an artist, like anyone who's making anything, one of the most important things that you can, like the most important skill you can have is an ability, like a self-awareness, right? About what you're making and where it sits in the culture, like in the discourse. You have very little control over it, but what you can control is your ability to perceive where it sits, like what it speaks to, what it's like, what context it's in, what it feels adjacent or proximal to. So, you know, when you're at art school, you have these crits, right? That's the fundamental part of how this conceptual education takes place, within that critical kind of conversation with your peers. And like, such a fundamental part of being in a crit is someone going, oh, have you heard of I don't know, some artist, Derek Jarman, let's say. Have you heard of Derek Jarman? No, it's kind of similar. A really important part of that learning is you go look up Derek Jarman and you find out what's similar, what about the work that you've made speaks to Derek Jarman's work, and like where the overlap and the crossover exists. I think that's kind of, maybe it's not branding, maybe it's just like, as an artist, you need to know how to articulate what it is that you're making, where it sits in the culture. That's branding, right? Like, branding feels like a cynical word, but it's just about like having a really good grip and like a coherent way of reasoning and describing what you do. And I think that is definitely, I mean, it's kind of shit that it's, sorry, I don't know if I'm swear. It's really, really bad. It's not ideal that kind of is tied to financial stability or like financial sustainability within the wider market. Like, regardless of whether that's to do with public or private funding, I think both types of funding do rely on an ability to articulate what you do. And I think that's unfortunate, because there are some works that are made that are like so inarticulable and sublime and like just in that weird soupy phase where you don't quite know what it is yet. There's an argument to be made for the in-between, but maybe it's just about funding bodies being risk averse than anything else.
When you brought up, articulating what you do, or the value of, of the crit, and, just this interaction, we had a question come in, and I'm just going to pull it up so I can read it, that I think is really relevant to this question. And it's about, and it's from Masood Eskandari, and it's, if, online presentation and representation, almost always this is a one-way street. The artist doesn't hear and see the reaction and feedback at the time of presentation. That's, a major difference between virtual and actual presentation. Thinking about, goes on to think about the position of the audience, and then also, a major part of art creation in the 21st and the 20th centuries. So he asks, have you thought about the concerns of maybe an argument about narcissism, the artist screaming and hearing their own voice echoed in this virtual format? Or I might add, do you think if you reach out in a virtual format, maybe you're hearing back from a different subset of people than you would have if you did this in a gallery?
I think I don't think that like online representation doesn't always have to be a one-way street. I think it just depends on like it depends on location, like the platform that you're using. Instagram feels a lot like a one-way street a lot of the time, especially when you're a smaller account. I think you can maybe have a little bit more of like a horizontal relationship with the people you're posting at or to or for, whatever, like whoever's on the receiving end. I think when there's a bigger account and there's like a cult of personality around that account, totally not speaking about white pube, like when there's like a perception of power, I think that can be a bit less horizontal. But there are other platforms, like we've recently been using Discord as a space for community, which is like a really abstract, like esoteric word. Like who knows what community means really online in this day and age? It's just a collection of people, right? But we've been using Discord as a way to build community and like have more meaningful and horizontal conversations with the people that make up our readership, and yeah, trying to find out who these people are, put names to faces, like have crits with them and find out what work they're making, and you know, I don't know, just have a chat, act like normal people rather than bizarre weirdos. And I think that doesn't necessarily, that's not a one-way street, because I don't know, now all of a sudden they're like my mates and it's fine, in quite a genuine, authentic, like totally not cynical way. I think that can sound like quite a cynical thing, but it totally isn't. And I think that's maybe less about presentation and representation, but I think it's a way of like handling the interaction that you're having with this, I don't know, online entity, but people online. I don't know, you can always turn it back onto your terms. I think there are ways to manhandle that.
Yeah, I kind of feel about it where it's like maybe through certain platforms you have the tendency to see like this one-way street, or kind of manifest itself. But I don't know, I think especially just on a personal note, I feel like I really do feel like we have kind of a narrow view on what existing online feels like, and I think even something like a Discord is an interesting way to kind of think about. And I agree, community is a funny word. It's a hard word to describe. What essentially, is a bunch of users in a room or in a space discussing something. I always just think of like I have fond memories of like forums and like using forums and discussing things on forums, and kind of like how those kind of small niche spaces and communities where we'd have those conversations, or they still exist and they exist in different ways, but I feel like, and who knows, maybe we'll be transitioning onto another side of using the internet and almost like in an older way, or in how we used it in the past. But again, this is an ideal kind of idealize my view on it. But I don't know if it has to be kind of like a one-way street. I just think maybe we've kind of been used to that for over the last 10 years or so.
Yeah, I think it's, how do you see it? Whether you see it as a broadcasting kind of medium, or is it a communication, it's like some feedback coming in. I know for a while I was doing these little drawings and publishing them, and I was very interested in conversation with people, and that became a source for generative, generating the next ones and so on. I think there's a great opportunity for that. I think there are challenges in differentiating and qualifying that conversation, but I think it could be much more conversant space than a broadcast space. And a lot of this is about models that we carry about how things are done. You do something and then you sell it, bring it to the market. This is our model, the way we see things. But I think there are these opportunities to, again, Patreon comes back as a way of saying there's a different model for sustaining the work, for generating, that actually short circuits some of these kind of formal constructs of marketplace, producer, content. And I think the more those things get mixed up, the more interesting the outcomes. What does it mean to collaborate with the participants to create something, to co-create? Do we still need to hold on to, authorship? Those kinds of, these are, I think, really wonderful questions. And if we can use the medium to open those questions up, I think it's a good thing when that happens.
The idea of, as you're saying, using maybe a medium that already exists, or how we use it, or maybe reverting to an earlier way of using a way of creating, maybe what you say, who knows what community means, but you can create one. Something that came up, and I sort of noticed as we were talking too, is that a lot of things were talking, it seemed that all of you, there was a thread, an idea of sort of like finding freedom to use these media that already exist, or platforms, or whatever we want to call them, that were created by someone else. But how could you, either as advice to an artist, find your own group, find the group you want to speak to, or as an artist deciding to make your own website, or deciding to present yourself differently, or your brain differently, and what makes you. And I think it's something they all actually sort of speak to, moving beyond maybe the superficial into finding that smaller audience, finding the like community, or representing yourself. The idea of authenticity has come up a lot as well. And I just, to me, that seems very positive. The idea that we could maybe use what we have in a way that works better for the way each of you wants to present your art, or how you want to share your thoughts about art to bring, more people to them. What do you think about the idea of maybe the more platforms, the more possibility, or does that strike you as chaos?
Like it. There's more variety, and like I kind of think back again to the concept of like forums and stuff like that, and like you have these more niche spaces to like discuss things. I think Discord kind of is like that. I'm not fully versed on the Discord, how it works, but like I think it's one of those kind of spaces that kind of there's so many different like groups and communities. I guess Instagram and all of these platforms could be like that, even Facebook at a time, I guess. But I find maybe it's just challenging. Like, we've all been on YouTube, and it's like suggesting things you just don't want to watch, right? Or your Instagram feed has things that you just don't want to see. I think that's where it gets challenging, where there's a lot of noise. So ironically enough, I think maybe having a variety of platforms, to kind of bounce between. I think we're trained a lot to just be on maybe a few things, and particularly on apps, like certain apps and stuff. But I know, like, again, one of the inspirations for True and Functional was to think about like, like it was like nostalgic, like when you would just surf the web and find websites, discover websites, and I feel like maybe even institutions, galleries, and outside of the art world too, just like having more dynamic experiences online, outside of social media, would be, in my opinion, welcome. But just one person, really.
No, I agree. I think it was really interesting, Timothy, what you said earlier about reverting to, not reverting like a bad thing, but like going back to maybe an older understanding of how an older dynamic of using the internet, right? Because it's interesting to hear like these tech bros like Mark Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, them lads, talk about like Web 3.0 and like the metaverse and like this immersive experience. I don't know, AR, VR, whatever you want to call it. That like as the future of the digital, right? But I think it is just like a not network fatigue, but like social fatigue, like a complete hyper visibility fatigue. If there's one thing I'm noticing in like people younger than me, which I know I'm like so young, but like I'm 27, so like aged in internet years, but like in younger like Gen Z internet use, what I'm really noticing is that like there is a kind of like, distance and irony with like that personal branding that like I don't know characterized like Instagram girl bosses. And this is like so not the point. This is just like me not even speaking as a critic. This is me speaking as like a TikTok user. But I think it's like I think the future of the web is really, really niche internet use, like multiple platforms, because there's like statistic, right, isn't there, that like people at the moment they have like 3 websites that they visit. I think it's 3. It's either 3 or 5, but like a really, really ridiculously small number of websites that they return to on like a daily basis. And anything outside of that 3 is like maybe single or double use. And it's just, but like majority of people's time is spent on 3 websites, like Twitter, Instagram, I don't know, Google maybe. But I really like the idea that that might be expanded, like maybe 7, maybe people will visit 7 websites. But it's interesting because on the White Pubes site, we don't have Google Analytics anymore. We used to, but we've recently switched from Wix to a static site generator, which means that we just kind of post on GitHub and it just kind of magically exists on the internet, God knows how. But when we did have Google Analytics, the analytics told us that like a small percentage of people came to the site from like Instagram, small percentage came from like Twitter, some came from organic search, like the SEO kind of stuff, but majority of our visitors came from like just directly typing the White Pube into the search bar, like the actual URL. People knew every, like on a Sunday at maybe like around 11 midday, there would be something on the site new-ish. No, not newish, completely new. We publish a new text every Sunday and people kind of know to expect that. And I don't know, it's interesting to think maybe about fairly independent or like smaller sites kind of like ours being added to that list of 3, now expanding it to 4 websites that people regularly visit. And I wonder if that's something that you, Timothy, have noticed, like people dropping in and kind of adding it to their roster of like small number of websites.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that like I use Wix as well, and like through the analytics, it's the same thing. Like the top one is people who maybe see something about my work and then like they just to type in trueandfunctional.com or Google it or something. And yeah, like that's one of those things where I do feel like I'm a little bit older than you, but 31. But I have the same conversations with like some of like my younger counterparts of like how, you know, for lack of a better word, they're just bored of like social media and like how it is, and kind of not taking it as serious maybe as maybe we have it in recent times. But yeah, I mean, it's not even really a surprise. I think these things go through a cycle. We forget how like Facebook, how big it was, and now like only so many people really use it. Not that billions of people don't use it, right? Like, and there's a whole infrastructure behind Meta, I guess now, and like Instagram, WhatsApp, and those things. But yeah, no, I think we, you know, in a way we could just be on the other end of the other side of that. The whole, you know, the internet going crazy over the Elon Musk buying Twitter. It's like that might. it might be another Yahoo, you know, in the next bit, or another Tumblr, right?
Oh my God, I hope so.
Yeah, right. So
I mean, it's like, speaking of Twitter, it's interesting because can't remember where I heard this. So this might be a jarg fact. Like this might be proper like pseudo misinformation. But I do remember hearing that apparently Twitter's users has taken like it's been stagnant, the number of like actual Twitter users. They've not seen user growth in years, and it's expected to drop off because like there's a finite amount of people that will ever or can be interested in using Twitter. Like they're just not growing a user base. And it's interesting to think of Twitter as a site that like it's a niche site, like for niche people that are just really interested in screaming at strangers. But like that's a niche hobby, valid. But I don't know. I think there's something interesting in thinking about these like enormous tech like companies that have like a complete monopoly over the like digital space as turning into niche sites. Yeah.
Well, I have a question actually thinking about the idea of site cyclical kind certain of these forms drop off, we stop using them, they become, be it unfashionable or what, however, for some reason they drop off or the technology changes or whatever, they're bought. One question, since we are, hosted by a museum, is, what do you think museums are responding to your digital content or the way you're presenting it? Should they be responding? Are you, how maybe are archives going to become digital repositories? It's really a question of, do you see a role in museums and archives possibly in seeking out and preserving, I would say, let's put a narrow field somewhere, but the, artist self-representation or artist projects that live only online?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting moment because, post-pandemic or as we move into, things have changed for museums too. I think numbers of people, bodies through the gallery is very much the model. That's shifting, something else now. We're not going to go back to that. So how does a museum, get online? What does it mean? How do you represent, in the same way? You don't present the artist in the same way. I think these are super interesting questions. And I know in our project, we tried to tackle some of that by looking at, again, this question around engaging the audience and getting the audience to become participatory in the creation. How does that change their experience of the museum? How does that change their experience of, the kind of the artist over there, me being the receiver over here. I think there are some there's fertile ground, let's say that, in terms of museum outreach into the online space.
Yeah, I think everything rolling after 2020 is kind of a nice welcome to see the institutions take on digital art a little more seriously. I have a lot of thoughts about it, but one of the things I will say, there is still definitely a hierarchy between like what's in a real space versus online, and I don't think it's just the nature of digital art or like web artist or whatever you want to say, but I think there's still
Is he mute? Oh, Timothy, I couldn't hear you from one for one moment there.
How about now?
Yes.
Yeah, I was pulling on something. Basically, I was just saying that I feel there's an obvious hierarchy between digital, like with the institutions and galleries and what we see online, like online programming versus the real space. Of course, like as an artist, like you put a lot of value into the tangible work, of course, and you want people to see that work. But I do feel like there's a lot of room for galleries and institutions to think more dynamic and creatively around like how they deal with virtual space or online space or something like that. There's again, as a nice welcome to see things. Unfortunately, the global pandemic caused it, but like, you know, just like a lot of things, like working from home for a lot of people, like they only made sense anyway for in a lot of industries. It only took a pandemic for that to happen. Like there's a lot of brilliant artists who work primarily online or with the non-tangible. And I feel like, yeah, again, there's so much room. I don't even have the answer for it. It might be something we can't conceive quite yet, right? But
we have one last question that comes from one of my colleagues, and I would love to maybe that'll be our ending question for this evening, but I do want to ask it. And it's, does being online require an embodied experience to be authentic? Is stating positionality unnegotiable?
I have a potentially stressful opinion.
Okay.
I'm just gonna throw it out there. I think well, I think authentic is kind of like a really difficult, it's a contentious term for me because I'm not entirely sure what it means. I think I do you know what I think? I think there an ability to be inauthentic or like be able to like make yourself malleable online is reliant on like a lot of things that you can't really control. So I hate wheeling this out, like this feels like such a gimmick, but as a critic of color, as a woman of color writing, being a critic, it's a bit more difficult for me to negotiate interactions with white institutions in the UK when I'm calling them racist. I feel like there are certain things that I can say that maybe go down a bit easier when Gab says them because she's a white woman, and like there's a different dynamic. I don't really have a choice in like handling that that part of my positionality. So I think this is where my stressful opinion comes in. I think that more people should lie online. I think there should be more like more playfulness with the fiction of that positionality. I think like there was a whole phase, right? Like, there was a moment in time when people used to just go onto like chat forums and lie about who they were. I think if we could reinsert some of that, like the opposite of anonymity, maybe. Like I think there's a lot of like discourse in the UK about how anonymity online is a way for like internet, like hate on the internet to happen. And I don't think it's the anonymity that's the problem. I think it's like it's this like underbelly, like this deep-seated belief that like, of course the UK is a racist country, of course it's like a, you know, a misogynistic country, like these things exist within society, that and anonymity just kind of allows these things to be spoken about because I don't know, British culture doesn't allow it to come to the surface in polite society. So I think I don't know if being online requires I don't know if stating your positionality is unnegotiable, but I think it should be negotiable. I think there should be a degree of like you should be able to intervene with the way that like you position yourself and like talk about yourself and the things that you reveal. And maybe there's like an element of like, I don't know, there should be an element of fiction in some of it to be able to get creative.
It'd be like, used to be like an obscene thing to say who you actually were online, like a nut.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, yeah. It's crazy to think about that. Yeah.
I'm kind of curious about the term embodied experience. Like what does that mean online?
I took it to understand like,
I'm still there. No, I'm still thinking about that. What does it mean to be? Yeah. What is an embodied experience online?
I took it to mean because embodied criticism is like a phrase that Gab and I use to describe our writing a lot of the time. I took it to mean like being able to cop to the body that you have, if that makes sense, like being able to kind of like admit to it or acknowledge it in some sense within like that digital sphere. Because often, like, I don't know, there's like, I feel like maybe in the late 2010s, like post-internet art, right? There was like an obsession with like a bodiless existence, or like the idea that the body could be spirited away. And it feels so dated now, like that as like a movement, like net art. Oh my God, like the post-internet pros, they're like dream of like a completely uncorporeal experience, like just full mainlining that tech, right? It's interesting that that feels dated, but I wonder if we will look back in like maybe even 5 years, because I don't know, was 2012 that long ago? Like it's only 10 years ago. I wonder if we'll look back in like 5-10 years and think about I don't know, our current preoccupation with candor about who we are, and like that kind of complete sincerity and earnestness. I wonder if we'll look back on that with the same kind of distaste, or like if it will feel kitsch or nostalgic in the same way. I don't know, maybe it will.
I think it's a good way to leave, thinking about how our future selves looking back and cringing maybe, or wondering where we were going. And I've lost the ability to move my PowerPoint forward. So if one of the unseen people who is helping run this wants to put up, I know that we, and first, let me just thank my panelists for a wonderful discussion. I wrote down about 800 other things I want to talk to you all about. And I hope that now we're mates, all of us, and can talk about these things horizontally, across our communications. But I really do want to thank you for taking the time to talk with us tonight. I want to thank our audience for their wonderful questions. And I also want to say this will be available, this recording, in about a week on the AGO website if you want to revisit it. I know that we have a poll, a survey, that's the right word, that we like to put up. And I also want to once again thank RBC as being such a signature partner and being a generous supporter of the AGO RBX Emerging Artist Workshops. But I know that we do. Well, thank you. I think I just will leave it with saying once again, thanking everybody for their time and their thoughts. And I hope that everybody has a wonderful evening.